I'm Logan Crawford, and
All
right
right.
now on Spotlight, we're speaking with R.D. Huzul, who is the author of a captivating novel called Dmitri, His Amazing Story, which explores the transformative experiences of a young man during World War II in Western Ukraine and his journey across Europe and Africa. We're delighted to have this very talented author join us here today on Spotlight. We thank the team at Atticus Publishing for helping us put him in the spotlight today. And we ask viewers like you to support writers like him by subscribing to our channel and by purchasing this marvelous book. Thank you so much for joining us here today, RD.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. It's quite a nice surprise. When I first developed this story a couple of years ago, I didn't know this would reach the heights it has already in the last couple of months since its publication. So it's quite an honor, sir, and I'm really delighted and honored to be with you today, sir.
Well, the honor is all mine. Your novel paints a vivid picture of Western Ukraine during the late
Mhm.
1930s. What drew you to explore this particular period and the region in history?
Well, it's because when I was growing up, my dad had a transportation company, and he was also involved in the Second World War. I won't mention which side, but he did hire a lot of people that had participated through friends, relatives, or her who knew other people who had participated and had sought action in the Second World War. This was in the 1960s, so I still can recall those vivid conversations with the personnel that my dad hired, and many times I overheard these conversations, and I just kept them in mind over the years. And I said, "Gosh." This is fascinating stuff these people are telling my dad, because the lives they led, the turmoil they went through, the experiences they responded to, the trauma, the resilience that they showed in getting through this horrific time in history. It just fascinated me, and I kept all this knowledge in my head for years and years. And I decided finally, a couple of years ago, I had an accident and it nearly crippled me while I was in the hospital. I said, "Gosh, I have all this great knowledge, this information, these stories from these people over the years who had lived this time period, the most horrific time in history." I said, "Gosh, why don't I do something with this? Develop a story." That's what I did with these stories, and from the which were disseminated from these people that my dad knew, and he lived through some of the part. Certainly he lived through it as well because he was growing up in that time period. And so I said, I have to do something because time is of the essence when I'm in the hospital. You just don't never know when your last day on earth will be. So I think that's when I decided I better put something down on paper, and I developed this story.
Well, we're glad you did. It is an incredible story. Dimitri's linguistic abilities play a significant role in his journey. How does the power of language shape the experiences and the decisions he makes throughout the story?
It's because he was a multilingual. He grew up in a multilingual family. Of course, I gave a lot of background on how and why he developed that fascination and the linguistic ability he had because he was growing up. Again, if you refer to the disclaimer, I do not condone war. And this is definitely, I have to ask people to refrain from referring it as a war story. It is not. It is a chronicle. What it is, in actual fact, it's a chronicle of this young man's growing up during this turbulent time period in history. So I want to emphasize that. Read the disclaimer, and I want them to know that it's not a war story. It is simply uh, a young man's desire to pursue a goal of his, a purpose of his. It was essentially the essence of his existence. That being a Ukrainian, loving his country, loving his family, and his nation, Ukraine, that is, that he wanted to see freedom, independence, because at that time, of course, the 30s, the 40s, and truly the 50s, the Soviet Union was certainly in charge of not only Ukraine but the other Slavic and non-Slavic republics of the Soviet Union. And of course, Joseph Stalin, was just brutal in the atrocities he did. There was many accounts of atrocities that the Soviets under Stalin at that time undertook, and especially against the people such as the Ukrainians. And of course, they were vehement over their entire history. They were never really independent as such. So that's and Dmitri's dead. And again, I just want to emphasize this is fiction developed from stories from friends and family members over the years, and that he is a composite character. So I just want to emphasize that. So what happened was he had gained this patriotic vibe within his soul that he just had to see his home country of Ukraine being independent and free of the Soviet Union's ruling over not only Ukraine but other republics that was the formerly Soviet Union at that time. Now, getting back to the linguistic expertise he adhered to, because his family was near the border of Romania. He also had every day he was dealing with Romanian kids, so he developed a knowledge of the Romanian language as well as his own Ukrainian language, and the Mennonite people. So what happened was, during the 17th century, Martin Luther and John Calvin had been persecuting the Mennonites in particular in Germany for their lack of their lack of adherence to German laws, and in particular the Lutheran laws. Now, because of that, the Mennonites uh, were distinct pacifists, and because of that fact, they were shunned. And so, another interesting fact, I discovered that Catherine the Great, who was one of the greatest leaders of medieval Russia, she was also German born. I did not know that. I discovered that through research. So, what happened was Catherine the Great, being the Russian Tsarina, had allowed these German um, um, people, such as the Mennonites, to emigrate to Russia and Ukraine. So that's where they took refuge. And as a result, they intermarried into the Ukrainians, and they were able to retain their culture. And so that's why Dmitri in particular was able to learn the German language and culture. So he was in a unique situation in learning different cultures. Like, he knew his own, of course, Ukrainian culture. He was dealing with Romanian people every day, being his friends, and of course, German culture he learned through his mom's ethnicity. So these were important factors in his upbringing, and certainly they led to his decisions. And in fact, he had to make a decision based on that, and then based on his love for his country. And so those were all instrumental keys in his decision to fight on the other side. So there you go. That's the basis of it.
Absolutely. And throughout the book, Dmitri has an internal struggle from deciding which side to support in the war to weighing his own moral compass. What inspired you to
Absolutely.
craft such a multi-dimensional character?
Well, it was important because when you read through things like philosophy and psychiatry, I picked up some background information on an individual by the name of Dr. Viktor Frankl. Are you familiar with him?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Yes.
what he said, I could read you excerpts of some of his famous quotes if you like, but I don't know if your show would allow would be too brief to allow some of it. But some of the things that Dr. Frankel uh, experienced, because his background, of course, he was a Austrian Jew, and he was also a trained and educated medical doctor and psychiatrist. So his family, of course, were captives and were all slaughtered in the death camps in Germany. Now I haven't got my finger, I forgot the name of the particular death camp, but that doesn't matter. The fact was he was a survivor, and he lived till I think it was the early 2000s, and he was still a lecturer in U.S. universities, including Harvard University, and dispensing his knowledge and his philosophy of life. Now this philosophy came from his, because I just backtrack a bit, because he was a medical doctor, he was a survivor. Why? Because he was able to give service. He had a purpose to the death camps, not only in terms of helping the injured and disabled people in the death camps, as well as the commanders and their guards and their facilitators. So he had a purpose, and that kept him alive. But not only that, while he experienced the horrors around him, he didn't let it get to him because of his training, his really disciplined attitude, his mindset, his ability to keep himself centered, not thinking about the past, the present, and the future. He was able to keep himself in the now. That enabled him to develop an attitude of positivity, which allowed him to survive. And because he had a purpose, he was able to keep going and not allow the horrors around him to envelop his soul and destroy him. And this is part of the background, which enabled me to understand better the background of this young man, Dmitri, in the book. And so this is why he had a purpose. He had a great spiritual background because of his family. He had a calling. He wanted to. He's such a patriotic young man that he wanted to do something about it, and he didn't like the horror of what the Stalinist Soviet Union communist regime was doing to his homeland. So he thought, based on, and of course, in many conversations with his family, he thought, I have to. He resolved in his soul, in his heart, that he has to do something. And because of his background, his linguistic ability, his philosophy on life, his strong patriotism, he was able to disseminate that to his family and say, I have to do this. And so he decided, when in the book I describe it vividly, when the Russians were coming literally to his doorstep, he decided, Mom and Dad, I have to leave. This is my purpose. This is what I have to do in my life to to see a better world, or at least for our homeland, because of his love for his country. And he was a great young man, a great, very curious young man. And this is an innate curiosity, his ability to grasp new information and knowledge. It just astounded me when I heard people like that were like this particular individual, who could grasp new things and enable them just to keep going. And this is what I found out through various conversations with people that I met over the years. And in fact, a lot of conversations recently, there have been a lot of refugees in Canada that I have met, and they said, yes, they had to develop an attitude of survival. They had to develop a survival instinct, or else they would perish in the war. And that's the sentiment I got recently when talking to a lot of refugees. And as well, this is what enabled me to input this into the storyline.
Well, we're glad you did, because it is an amazing story. It is an amazing book, and it's a terrific character. It is called Dmitri, His Amazing Story. It explores the transformative experiences of a young man during World War II in Western Ukraine and his journey across Europe and Africa. RD, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I wish I could talk about, and I could give you some. Is there time to even give you one quote from Dr. Frankel? I'd
Sure,
love
we'll
to.
leave the audience with a quote. Go ahead, my friend.
Okay, these are marvelous quotes that Dr. Viktor Frankl said in his book. His book, you can probably find it. It's called Man's Search for Meaning.
Mhm.
You can probably find it online. It's wonderful. But I just had a time to write down a few quotes. I'll give you one just in passing. Okay, in one of his more famous quotes here, he said, "The one thing you can't take away from me is the way I choose to respond." And he was saying this, of course, in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And he further says, the last of one's freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any given circumstance. And he further says, happiness cannot be pursued. It must be ensured. It must be inside of the happiness. The sense of happiness must be, in joy must be inside of you. That's what he's saying. And then finally he says, this is another one. Life is never made unbearable by circumstance, but only by a lack of meaning and purpose. I think that sums up my book quite distinctly and quite thoroughly.
I agree.
What do you think?
I agree. It sums up the book nicely. It's a wonderful book. Again, the name of the book is Dmitri, His Amazing Story. I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.